And welcome to today's webinar on reviewing energy supply chains, opportunities and innovation for the future. Today we're very lucky to have Neera and Arrow with us to present. So I'd just like to introduce Miranda Taylor, who is the CEO. Miranda is a strategic and adaptive leader at the forefront of collaboration and innovation across the Australian energy resources sector. Chief Executive of NERA since its inception in 2016, Miranda brings a deep and broad range of energy and resources industry experiences, skills and capabilities. Her leadership of NERA is bringing together the country's best minds from technology, research and enterprise to achieve NERA's vision of Australia as a global energy powerhouse, a sought-after destination of investment and leading source of knowledge and solutions. NERA is working with industry, universities, researchers, entrepreneurs, innovative SMEs, skills initiatives and governments to support the cultural change and new thinking required to overcome barriers to collaboration and innovation, and to ensure Australia's energy resources sector is staying ahead of the global automation technology transformation. Also speaking today to provide an overview of NERA is Paul Hodgins. As General Manager, Innovation and Stakeholder Engagement on the East Coast for NERA, Paul works with stakeholders to increase the productivity, competitiveness and export potential of the energy resources sector. Paul has spent over 20 years exploring the competitiveness of businesses, industries and regions and designing and implementing strategies to improve performance through innovation and collaboration. As well, joining us today is Jason King from Arrow. So Jason is Arrow's General Manager of Contracting, Procurement and Logistics. He is responsible for managing all procurement, supply chain and logistics activities for Arrow. He has 20 plus years of experience in management consulting in both private and public sectors in the United Kingdom, Europe, Asia and the Americas. Also online today to assist with some of the questions in the later will be Lisa Elder, who is the Vice President of External Relations and Tenure Management with Arrow. Lisa joined Arrow from Santos and has been a member of the executive leadership team since 2009. As VP, External Relations and Tenure Management, she has more than 30 years international experience in environmental, social and governance, ESG risk assessment and management, social performance, and media and government relations in both private and public sectors. Just as a very short summary of some of the current movement in the market. So while today NERA will be presenting to us on a survey that was published in late 2019, we are now in exceptional times with the Russian and Saudi price war and extremely low commodity prices. Something has to change in our industry. Globally, it is hard to get a handle on global production and what is in static storage, with likely overproduction from 10 to 20 million barrels over 2 months. We've probably produced over 1 billion barrels of oil that has gone into storage somewhere, not factoring what is already in hand. This supply glut is going to have to get unlocked and operators will want to have their assets running. A recent webinar that featured keynote speakers on the energy and tech outlook with the 2020 crisis and opportunity in oil and gas with a view for the next 12 to 24 months, Dan Genovese, director at Enercom, commented that he thought while oil and gas prices are related, he thinks US oil prices will remain low for the next 12 to 24 months. Gas prices will possibly firm up a bit, but in this environment and with a decline in the oil and gas market, a lot of hard, loyal workers will be laid off. The industry will have to recreate itself on the backside and get some of these jobs back. A couple of takeaways. The upside is that it will be a time to embrace the creative destruction that will come along with some bankruptcies, mergers or acquisitions. And as balance sheets are cleaned up, this will move assets into hands with the best operational and management teams. So improvements in operational efficiencies at lower breakdown production costs, technology and technique will be critical to our market. There've also been some discussions recently around whether gas prices will be less aligned with oil prices going forward, particularly in Australian unconventional gas. Efficiencies and lower production costs will be under the microscope. An article I read recently with an unidentified source from a CEO perspective from an exploration and production company stated that he believes in the next 5 to 7 years will be an IT company that happens to produce oil and gas. The way oil is produced is fundamentally changing. We have always done the same thing the same way, and we have to learn a new way to do things. It is a challenge, but also a great opportunity to get ahead of the curve. Low prices when at a macro level, we are seeing the greatest economic retraction in 100 years and the lowest oil prices in over 50 years. With a retraction at a micro level, companies normally withdraw on spending or innovation or new technology. However, tech development is usually created around a pain point and then drives innovation, which also requires investment and experimentation. Most companies will not spend money on trials in an economic downturn, but if a solution is provided that improves efficiency and reduces reactive maintenance, then now is the time to showcase Australian exporters' capability, both and also domestically. While this all sounds negative, in the short term, we have the innovation and technology in our regions with advanced manufacturers, with service technology to embrace these opportunities. So it is an exciting time for digital technology development. Our region is already servicing operations in energy. So how do you get ahead of the curve? How can you introduce innovation and technology and be a part of that future supply chain to drive efficiencies and collaboration? We have a great opportunity to build a supply chain for export to new markets, for energy resources, and with our growth centre partner NERA, the Southern Queensland Export Hub is here to support the regional businesses on this journey and encourage collaboration to leverage our global platform. This is a good segue into today's discussion with how SMEs in our region have the opportunity to respond to these opportunities based off some learnings from the recent survey published by NERA. So I'll now hand across to Paul Hodgins, who will speak.
Look, thanks very much, everyone. I'm really just here to give a short overview of NERA for those that aren't aware of NERA. NERA is National Energy Resources Australia. We're one of 6 industry growth centres. They're independent organisations, but they're established under the Industry Growth Centres Initiative, which is a federal government initiative to really focus on Australia's priority sectors and to grow them through productivity, competitiveness, innovation, collaboration, and greater levels of export performance. You're probably, people online are probably aware of some of the other ones, METS Ignited in the mining equipment technology and services space, MTP Connect in medical technologies and pharmaceuticals, FIAL, which is another industry growth centre partner in the Export Hub, which is Food Innovation Australia Limited. There's AusCyber in the cybersecurity area, and AMGC is the Advanced Manufacturing Growth Centre. Our vision is Australia is a global energy powerhouse. We are a global energy powerhouse. We are a 350% energy economy. We export more than 2/3 of our energy resources. We want to maintain and grow that through a really transformative period in energy globally. We want to be a sought-after destination and for investment, and also the leading source of knowledge and solutions. And I think that's really a key part of the Export Hub, is how do we not only be known for supplying high quality, reliable energy to the world, but how do we also provide the services, the knowledge, the technology to the world as well, and if you like, get a double whammy from our knowledge. So we've got, we've got a multifaceted energy resources sector. We therefore need a multifaceted response. We have a range of parts of NERA, and when I say parts of NERA, NERA is only a dozen people spread across the country, but we are looking at things like optimizing the resources industry, energy resources industry today. I'll talk a little bit about some of the projects that we do in that space, adapting for tomorrow, and then also transforming for the future. So a number of things, and I'll run through some of the initiatives, not to give a comprehensive overview, but to really, I guess, give you a flavour of some of the things we get involved in. But I'm the General Manager, Innovation Stakeholder Engagement for the East Coast. I'm based in Brisbane, and we're all accessible by email and phone and every pretty much online platform, particularly at the moment. So we're always keen to chat about how we might be able to assist you. We, as each industry growth centre has, we have a 10-year sector competitiveness plan. It really sets out, in our case, 8 knowledge priorities and a number of initiatives, gives an update on the sector. We update that each year, and the 2020 update has just gone a little bit of extra revision with COVID-19 recently, and will be out in the next couple of months. But a good read, I think, for people who are really wanting to look at how their business, how their region sits within it. We pull in a lot of statistics, a lot of analysis, and a lot of consultation with the industry to make sure that the plan is current. Along with operational funding, the federal government provided each industry growth centre with some collaborative project funds that we deployed with industry. In NERA's case, $15.6 million, over 160 project partners, and we've got the potential to unlock another $10 billion of value to the Australian economy. I don't expect you to memorize all those projects. There won't be a quiz later, but that's the projects and that's the spread. You can see very spread, quite distributed quite a lot across the country. A number of projects in the coal seam gas, Toowoomba, Surat Basin area, particularly there on the right side of the screen, but also a number of national projects that anyone can tap into. And what we really like is bringing together small and medium enterprises with large customers, trial partners, operators, and also with research institutions. We think that's a really positive for the economy. We do a lot of thought leadership work. So Miranda's going to talk about our most recent one in the oil and gas supply chains growth area. But we, with Mets Ignited, did a report on staying ahead of the game around new technologies, and particularly digital, robotics, automation, and the like. And that came out, I think, actually it was a couple of years ago now. We also did a report through UQ on building Australia's energy literacy. There's not a clear view of what energy, even how the energy sector works in Australia. A lot of people are quite challenged by that, and it doesn't actually necessarily always lead to the best decision making if we don't always come from some factual and evidence-based and a common perspective. And we also did a report on oil and gas future workforce, which if you are in the oil and gas sector is really great reading. But even for other sectors, talks very much around the changing nature of not just the oil and gas sector, but really a number of our sectors as we sort of head towards more robotics, automation, and digitization. We like to get out and promote our stories. So we put out 2 creating our new energy futures books, both with 7 case studies of projects that we've worked on. And we are working on a 3rd one at the moment. They're a magazine style approach to it, hard copy principally, because in the age of digital, there's actually, in some ways, there's quite a niche back towards having something in your hands with that you can look at and you can distribute. So that's been quite successful in really promoting the sector and promoting some of our successful SMEs and projects right across not just Australia but the world. Talk about the world. So we do promote the energy resources sector globally, and particularly the SMEs and the supply chain to build Australia's reputation in the knowledge and solutions space. You've got on the screen there's a number of events that we've taken a strong presence at, right from places in Europe, in North America, and even here in Australia as well, where we've had strong international engagement, such as our annual signature event at Australasian Oil and Gas in Perth each year, where we do a number of SME connector events with industry, but also Gas Tech, where we took a number of companies to Barcelona. We had Australia's first pavilion, and we had probably about 15 suppliers there, but it was a really strong success. And we actually worked with those innovators, including out of Southern Queensland, to get their pitch right for an international audience through a Smart Australia program beforehand. And more recently, the Asia Pacific Unconventional Resources Technology Conference. We sponsored the welcome reception in Brisbane, and we had 15 innovators pitch as part of that welcome reception on the first night, including some from the region. And that was a great success as well, added a creative element to the conference program. And then also some of the local work we're doing. So I really wanted to plug the Surat Basin Energy Awards, which is still open for applications. We at NERA has decided to be the innovation sponsor for the inaugural awards. We're really keen to support the region. I'm also, as part of my role, mentoring accelerator participants in the current METS Innovation Regional Accelerator Program, which is happening with startup Toowoomba. Every Tuesday for about 6 weeks, there's going to be an online mentoring and sort of information session. So encourage people to join that if they like. The other things, I guess, that I haven't mentioned all the things, but Mimosa, so the open industrial interoperability ecosystem. We're for people working in the digital asset management space. We ran a couple of sessions the last couple of days. And we're really looking at putting an Australian arm to that. It's based out of North America, but because we don't own proprietary systems in Australia, it's really good for our suppliers and small and medium enterprises for us to be promoting a much more open ecosystem that they can plug and play into. We've also been tasked to develop a national hydrogen industry cluster. As part of the National Hydrogen Strategy. I know that in the region and across regional Australia, there's great opportunities to get involved in hydrogen. We want to see us be a quality and competitive producer of hydrogen, a user of hydrogen, but we also want to be able to put the best of our hydrogen knowledge and solutions into global supply chains. So the cluster will really help SMEs to collaborate, to build their capability, to build their capacity, to accelerate opportunities, to hunt as a pack and build scale for integrated solutions globally. And we're establishing that at the moment. So if you're interested in hydrogen through Helen, I know that Helen's also interested in hydrogen, and the export hub will be too as it continues on. We also facilitate access to funding and support. So we've almost extinguished our own funding. I should say we did recently have a COVID-19 innovation challenge as well. We had a fantastic response. We had about 50 companies, SMEs in the energy resources supply chain come to us with that. We're finalizing some of those. You may have seen one announced last week, Speed 3D, looking at copper, 3D printed copper coating of handling surfaces. So whether that's door handles or the like, their activated carbon 3D printing can effectively guard against the transmission of coronavirus. We also, as saying, facilitate access to funding and support. So obviously the small and medium enterprise export hub funding that we were happy to support Toowoomba Surat Basin Enterprise on. But there's also a range of industry and research funding programs such as from the ARC and the CRC program. The particular one of interest, I think, to SMEs is probably the Cooperative Research Centre project funding. It's led by a business with at least one other business and at least one research institution. So rather than being led by research, it's led by industry, and it's very much around moving something from lab scale or kind of technically proven to being commercially proven. So in some ways, it kind of is very similar to the sort of projects that NERA's put in place through its project fund. And there's a range of other things as well. But what I can do is encourage people to come and have a chat, make contact with me, telephone, email, Zoom, GoToMeeting, LinkedIn, whatever it is, to have a chat about how we can assist you. And that's me finished, Helen.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you very much for that. So I'll hand over to Miranda, who will respond now on the survey. And I'd also ask you, if you have any questions, please keep putting those up, and we'll have, and just identify, I repeated, who you would like the question put to, and we'll look at that at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
So are you able to put my presentation up, or do I need to, Paul, are you able to share my presentation?
How are you going, Helen? Do you have I can do yours if you like, Miranda. Hang
Yeah,
on.
could you? Yeah.
Yes, I
yeah.
will. I'll just bring it up.
It just means I'll have to ask you to go
No,
to
that's
this.
okay. So let me go. Okay, hang on. I'll just try that again.
While we're waiting, Paul's managing it. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Paul.
That's okay.
So thank you for inviting me to talk to you all today, and welcome to all the participants, 76 I think I can see on here. This is an incredibly timely opportunity to talk to you about the NERA study that we undertook with Alpha Beta into the oil and gas supply chain in the light of where we find ourselves in COVID-19. And thanks for putting the context at the beginning of the session. Helen, thank you very much. I think there's no doubt that one of the conversations that's beginning to emerge quite strongly in Australia today is, what does Australia look like post-COVID-19? Where we don't want to be is a reversion to the past. And there is that very danger. And one of the conversations that I think is a bit disturbing is a conversation that appears to be around positioning the gas industry as almost the servant of the manufacturing industry, as opposed to embracing the discussion for, we have had, and Australia has benefited over many decades from huge investment and very sophisticated resources industries. But we all agree that apart from, perhaps more so in the met sector, that we haven't had an accompanying strength in our manufacturing sector to support that. And indeed, in the oil and gas industry, as a result, our supply chain has been dominated by global supply chains. And there are all sorts of reasons why the time that we're at now is a perfect time to start to bust up that model and to look at the opportunity for supply chains to grow in Australia, and particularly for those to grow around advanced manufacturing and more sophisticated technologies. So when NERA kicked off to do this study, which was actually early last year, I started talking to Alpha Beta about the potential, because there has not really been any study, other than perhaps from a local content approach, into the global supply chain, or the supply chain situation for the oil and gas sector. There's been quite a bit done on the met sector, and obviously I think in Queensland probably a bit more than across the rest of the country. And obviously with TSBE, there's been much more of a focus of the supply chain around the coal seam gas sector. But overall, it's not really been well understood, and there's been quite a lot of mythology around what some of the barriers and enablers are in the supply chains. So we undertook this study, and it's come into the market. We've been able to share it at such a perfect time, because we are fundamentally now in those discussions. So Paul, could you go on to the next slide, please? So I think the fundamental thing that we all agree is that our future prosperity is going to require us to think differently and do things differently. And I think one of the things that still is disappointing is that we still tend to be very fragmented across Australia in terms of our approach to our industry strategy. So we've got some great things across the country. Paul's touched on some of the things like the CRCs, the very fact that the federal government launched an industry sector approach was fundamentally in recognition that we need to build across industry sector collaboration and look at what the potential is for Australia from advanced manufacturing technologies being deployed in the sectors where we've got comparative advantage, whether that be agriculture, defence, space, mining, whatever. We really do have a big opportunity there. But unfortunately, we're still quite fragmented, and we still, while there's lots of examples of some fantastic work going on with digital technologies, we're still not as far along as we will need to be. And of course, we've been paralysed by the inability to firm up our position on how we want to manage the transition to a low carbon future, and indeed how digital technologies and advanced technologies can actually enable that over time, and what's our pathway for getting there. So there is no doubt that we're going to see some structural changes to the economy going forward. And there is a huge potential to strengthen what TSBE and others have been doing so successfully to build a domestic supply chain that is really innovative and a high value, at the high value end, and to make sure that the Australian economy is resilient and diverse going forward. And I don't think it's going to be a case of shutting all our borders and closing off global trade, although that is certainly a challenge that we're in at the moment. It is, we do not want, Australia does not want that. That's not a good outcome for us. But we do need to have more resilience, and we do need more local manufacturing. So Paul, next slide, please. So we need to increase investment in innovation, and we need to grow more high value. So the only way we can do it is to have an economy that is more diverse, as I've just said. Paul, you could skip through this one and the next one because you've already covered the next slide. So that's fantastic, thank you. So looking at the supply chain report, the study that we did with Alpha Beta wasn't just a survey. We did do interviews and surveys across the whole sector, and with the operators, the oil and gas operators, with large supply chain companies, and also with SMEs and also some startups in the sector, to try and get a cross-section of views of what's happening in the supply chain. But in addition, Alpha Beta also did a lot of data searching to actually get some information around the size and the potential for the supply chain. They identified that the supply chain is not reaching its full potential relative to the scale and value of the production industry. And this really goes to the heart of the point that there's no doubt that the resources sector, the oil and gas sector, as it has been, innovative. They've been doing some cutting edge work in automation. The oil and gas industry moved to digital oil fields a long time ago, but we've perhaps plateaued. And there's a huge opportunity now to move that curve along and to actually look at the real potential. The supply chain analyzes the size and composition of the domestic supply chain and shows that we could capture an additional $7 billion of value and generate up to $49 billion to the economy if we could expand our supply chain. Next slide, please. The local supply chain is a vital contributor to Australia's economy already and generates almost 2% of the GDP. However, if you compare the local supply chain to our global peers, it's relatively small and there's still huge potential. Next slide, please. So some of the key challenges that our report identified, and I think this will come as no surprise to anybody. We do at the moment still tend to focus on relatively low complexity and highly localized work, and I'll come to some quite good diagrams in a short while that really illustrates this point. So the problem is with this is that when we're focused on things which are quite localized, it's very difficult to take those into global export markets and to actually therefore grow. The other thing for the big operators is that Australia's high costs mean that if we're not operating at the high value end of manufacturing, then it's going to dampen the opportunity for operators in Australia to partner with our supply chain because the high cost with low value don't make a good story together. It's difficult for SME suppliers to start and grow in the oil and gas supply chain if they're not operating at that high value end. And given that they've got to compete with a highly integrated and mature global oil and gas supply chain sector. And if we're going to disrupt that model, we need new business models, exactly like TSBE has done, things like clusters, and also, as Paul alluded to with the work that we're doing around interoperability, it's using the technology advantages that are coming out of the transformation from advanced manufacturing and Industry 4.0 to open up and move to open source technology where different bits of equipment can read between each other, and so therefore it basically opens up the ability for SMEs and vendors to compete in a way that they couldn't in the past because of proprietorial, locked-in, closed systems. So there's a whole range of things, clusters, technology, living labs, which are going to facilitate us make this change in the supply chain. Next slide, please. So the opportunity for growth is enormous. There's a couple of things. SMEs really need to understand buyers' priorities, and one of the things that as a general rule across the oil and gas sector, and there's pockets of where it's been done better, but as a general rule, the buyers, the operators haven't always been able to share in any detail what the opportunities are to the supply chains. That is definitely begun to change, and I think that's indicative of the fact that the industry was, if you go back 5-10 years, very much in construction, design, construction, commissioning, building, that phase, and there was only a couple of quite mature projects around the country, and now we have many more companies, operators have moved into the operational phase. And that means that we're in a much more mature phase of the oil and gas industry's relationship in Australia, and there's huge opportunity to open up and share what the opportunities are, and that's certainly happening in Queensland in the regions, and it's beginning to happen in the offshore industry as well. Next slide, please. Now the interesting thing, this is quite an interesting one. We did a bit of a survey of what the buyers thought was relevant versus what the suppliers thought was relevant. And as you can see, it's not wildly different, but it is different. And it just goes to show that culturally that we make a lot of assumptions about what we think different parts of the market are interested in. So, you can all see the slide, but just by way of example, suppliers put cost competitiveness as a very high relevance, and the buyer's assessment of relevance was much smaller, which is an interesting find. Buyer's assessment of relevance was track record and trust, and they put that quite high, and the suppliers did put that high, but not quite as high as the buyers saw it. And the buyers assessed effectiveness of the goods or service quite low, whereas the supplier's perception of relevance was quite high. Now, this doesn't mean that either of those perceptions is actually, it's a perception view. So that it's not a science, but I do think it's interesting because it goes to the heart of how close is the relationship and how well do we understand each other when we're making decisions about the interaction between the supply chain and their end users. Next slide, please. So I think the learning from that is that suppliers really need to deepen their areas of strength and develop more advanced offerings if they're going to improve their global competitiveness. And I think the big opportunity is, as everyone here would know well, is in the predictive maintenance, remote operations, and safety enhanced tools and services. Next slide, please. Now this I think is a really lovely graph, and it goes to the heart of what I was saying earlier, and I think indeed what most of the conversation that is happening in Australia at the moment. There's an article in the Australian today by Roy Green about the research, the future for Australia, and research and education. And it really is about how do we position the resources sector and the oil and gas sector as partners with the advanced manufacturing sector. So how do we move? We do not want the future to be just replicating manufacturing to look like big old industries. We want the Australian manufacturing industry of the future to be very, very different and way up the high value curve. Where we've tended to be at the moment, and this bears out in many surveys that have been done globally. So Harvard University did a survey on the complexity of economies, and notwithstanding that there are always some limitations to some of these comparisons, and therefore one has to be a little bit careful. Nevertheless, Australia did rate low, very low indeed, on the complexity of our economy. And I think this really highlights it, that most of where our capabilities currently are is in that left-hand quadrant, not in, and where we need to be is on the right-hand, or we need to at least move down towards the right-hand quadrant and have more there. So we're very good at drilling services and well services and transport and logistics, etc., but less so on large-scale manufacturing. And if we start to work cross-industry sectors, if you take things like turbines, there's a brilliant opportunity for the gas industry to partner with the renewable sector, and we're already doing so in beginning to get scale around producing wind turbines and partnering. So there's enormous opportunities for Australia going forward to not see our future as only being in one area, but to see it as an and at the moment the language too often becomes polarizing. I think we really need to change that conversation to say we need a transition pathway that embraces all opportunities, and that we can transfer knowledge between industry sectors. So next slide please, Paul. This really just emphasizes what I've just said, that suppliers can capture higher value activities that match our high cost basis. And that is really the opportunity for us. If we extend to areas of lower local advantage, then Australian suppliers can develop capabilities that are exportable and less dependent on the local investment cycle. So that just really emphasizes what I've said before. Next slide, please. Now this slide, I hope you can all see it. It's quite good being able to do this on Zoom as opposed to do it as a presentation in a big forum. Glasses like this don't really have are very difficult to address when you're in a big forum, but you guys can all see it. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of where we've got some strengths currently and some examples of where we're actually doing very well. So I'll just pick one or two, and then I'm quite happy for TSBE to share these slides post this webinar, and also for you to be able to access our supply chain report so that you can actually see all this material which is actually in the supply chain report itself. So if I just pick the top, which is operations and maintenance, the one strength is the inspection, maintenance and repair, and its technical expertise in developing and handling and developing robotics or robots for remote operations. And there's no doubt that remote operations is emerging as one of Australia's unique and very strong areas. And then we've given examples. Geo Oceans has developed specialized software and hardware to remotely operate vehicles and carry out demand inspection and maintenance services. And there are many examples of these, and I'm not going to go into every one. I would just, the next one is around remote operations, and Fugro has partnered with Woodside, and they've got a remote operations platform, and they're partnering with the Space Agency around communications to support resilient communications for remote operations. So there's so many examples like this across the country, but at the moment we haven't got a cohesive story that's bringing them all together. Next slide, please, Paul. I think one of the things that I would really want to emphasize and take away from this, and I think it's what the TSBE and the Surat is doing so well and bringing a regional focus is this cross-industry transfer. So if I come back to my point about it's and my point about we've got strengths and resources, but we want to build advanced manufacturing. So we know we've got strengths in mining, we know we've got strengths in energy, we have got strengths in agriculture. We've actually got quite a strong presence in Australia of the space sector, and it's growing. And the space sector wanting to learn, to be able to work with the mining and oil and gas sector to fast test out what might they need to, in terms of being able to do inspection and maintenance in a space stations, and how can we transfer some of the learnings between the sector. And I think this is going to be fundamental. We can no longer operate in discrete supply chains in the future. We can no longer operate as individual industries in silos. We actually need to open up, and we need to find innovation wherever we can find it and fast transfer it and work together. Australia's opportunity is going to be so much greater if we know where we compete, and we know where we actually benefit from collaboration, and the size of the prize will be so much bigger for us all if we actually collaborate together. There's no doubt that competition is an essential ingredient in maintaining the edge and pushing for innovation. But there's also true that there's an awful lot of areas that at the moment where we're holding on to proprietary knowledge, data, and other stuff, which actually is not really achieving a great deal of value. We think it is, but it isn't. And opening up that from operators, supply chain companies, research organizations is an enormous thing for Australia if we can get there and do this fast transfer. Many of these advanced technologies, robotics, drones, are not, they've got relevance across all of our sectors. And for our supply chains to get scale and to be able to compete, they need to be able to supply to more than one industry sector. So they need to see themselves not as an oil and gas supply chain company, but as a technology, an advanced manufacturing technology that is supplying across sectors. They may well have niche specialities because there's things that you know, are unique. And I also think things like the fact that digital technology is enabling living labs and digital twins and simulations is making it much safer for companies like oil and gas and utilities and others, which are actually critical infrastructure and high risk major hazard facilities, for us to be able to open up and do innovation and collaboration is only possible if we can do it in a safe environment, because we are operating critical assets and infrastructure. And the other thing I would say is that in a digital future, all of our assets are going to be far more dependent on each other. They're going to be much more integrated. So the need to collaborate and you know, to work together is going to be much bigger, because as an oil and gas sector, we're now dependent on water, and we're dependent on digital technology platforms and a whole lot of other things. So it's a very different world, and I think therefore what you're able to do in the regions like TSBE, where you're able to work across all these sectors and look at the technologies, is where we need to be in Australia going forward. Next slide, thank you, Paul. In fact, we can probably go on past that one. So what now? So I've already talked about the opportunity for growth and the need for us to work out a larger area that we can collaborate in. We need to push the boundaries of where it is safe for us to partner and collaborate and innovate from where we've traditionally been. We also need to look at future proofing. So in this challenging oil price time, where it's very uncertain what's going to happen, you could get out a crystal ball and try and predict what's going to happen with oil prices or gas prices going forward and over what time frame. But we know that over 10, 20, 30-year time horizon, we are on a pathway to decarbonize, and we're on a pathway to potentially uptake of hydrogen and other big opportunities. And so there is no doubt that operators today will not be turning even in challenging oil price environment, indeed precisely because they're in an oil price challenged environment, they're going to have, they will be looking at how they're going to future-proof their business. What's the future going to look like in 10 years for their industry? And will they won't necessarily call themselves an oil and gas operator any longer. So, you know, there's no doubt there's big challenges, big opportunities ahead. I think I would say that through the last commodity price fall, 2016, 15, 16, we sort of achieved the efficiencies, like that we've been through a capital discipline and efficiency phase. Those low-hanging cost savings are not there any longer. We've pruned back as far as we can, notwithstanding that there will be some short-term, medium-term deferral of projects and therefore, you know, workforce implications. The real opportunity, therefore, is going to be where we can create value. The whole focus is where is the value and how are we going to achieve that value? How are we going to realize that value? Next slide, please. So this is just one example. I've already mentioned remote operations, but what I think is the enormous opportunity is from clusters and regional centres like Arose or like the hydrogen cluster, or that we've got NERA is supporting a subsea cluster, and that, just by way of example, that subsea cluster through this COVID-19 challenge has partnered with similar clusters in Norway and in the North Sea, UK, Aberdeen, and they are actually lending each other personnel to do inspection and maintenance tasks because they can't travel. So they're actually using their cluster partnerships across the world to actually enable them to do business in this very challenging time. And I think that's just, you know, really highlights the real value of clusters, of different business models that can challenge the traditional oil and gas supply chain model of big globally integrated, vertically integrated companies to actually deliver something different. We've also mentioned the Mimosa cluster, which is focused around interoperability. And that is very much about NERA trying to support SMEs to come into the discussion or into the work that's being done by the big end of town around common standards and data interface at an enterprise level of all bits of equipment, sensors, everything, and enabling the SMEs to be able to plug and play as their technologies in a vendor neutral environment. So I think clusters are really, really important. Doesn't matter what we want to call them. And I know there's lots of discussions around that go on about this, about what's a cluster, what's a hub, what's a center of excellence. I don't really care, but it's a grouping. It's a grouping of small businesses, and some of the CRCs could be clusters in a different world if they were genuinely industry led and not just driven by universities. And I think if you look at the blue economy, there's a blue economy CRC in Tasmania with a national focus that's got the fishing industry, aquaculture industry, and offshore engineering. So they're looking at how do they support the salmon fishing industry expand by going into deeper water, and how can they partner with the expertise that the oil and gas sector can bring to them in working in marine environments with offshore infrastructure and engineering, and also what's the potential to repurpose offshore infrastructure for say renewable projects to support offshore aquaculture projects, or could we partner with biotech to look at biotech solutions for carbon? There's lots of really interesting and innovative things emerging around these. So next slide, please. So these are just some examples of some of the projects, and I won't go into them because I think they're sort of down to the specifics. But what they highlight is that there is on the ground, there are some enormously innovative small businesses across Australia doing some amazing things. But at the moment, they're not yet getting the scale, and they're not really entering global markets at the point, they've got tentative feels into the markets globally, but they're not yet at the scale and size that we need them to be. So these are the areas that I think are the big opportunity for Australia. I think our supply chain has really highlighted the opportunity and the size, and I would so the supply chain study is available on our website. I really think there's an exciting opportunity for Australia if we can grab it, and I really, really hope that we see it as a win-win, and it's a partnership between all sectors, not a positioning cheap gas to enable a manufacturing model that isn't where we need to be. It should be gas, it should be energy, the energy sector and an advanced manufacturing sector and a resources sector partnering to make Australia a high value and exciting, resilient, diverse economy. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. And I look forward to meeting some of you in person in the future.
Thank you very much for that, Miranda, and thank you, Paul, for your introduction as well. I guess some key learnings out of that, we've got the potential to grow our resource sector by about $7 billion over the next 10 years. And there's some really exciting opportunities there, I guess, if we identify clusters or work with advanced manufacturing. And like Miranda said, that we can no longer just choose to be involved in one industry. We need to work across sectors. So I guess we'll probably leave some of there are some good questions coming through, so we'll probably let Jason, but I guess one really example that everyone would be able to relate to in that regard is every time you bought a new phone, regardless whether it was Apple or Samsung, you had to go buy a new charger, and that in Europe they're starting the law, and the US there's also with that saying to them, this is ridiculous, we've got to come back and start conserving on saving things as opposed to this continual waste. So that is one thing that is coming through at the moment, getting a common charger across all different brands.